This week on Quality Digest Live, we chat with Steve Dahm of PQ Systems about the importance of capability analysis.
Plus, when it comes to innovation, are you a manager or an enabler? We'll find out when we come back.
Well, welcome back everybody to Quality Digest Live for December 9th, 2016. QDL is your weekly look at who and what is making the news in the world of quality. I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest.
And I'm Quality Digest editor-in-chief, Dirk Ducharme. You know, we talk a lot about manufacturing here on Quality Digest. Manufacturers are a big part of our audience. And of course, when you talk about manufacturing, you talk about jobs. And when you talk about jobs, you eventually at some point talk about robotics.
Automation.
And when you talk about robotics, you usually end up saying something like, sure, they're great for repetitive tasks, but my job is secure. I mean, my job is so complex, a robot couldn't possibly take it over. I mean, look at my job, right? I sit at a desk and drink coffee all day. I mean,
that's hard.
Because it would make them rusty if they were to do my job.
The thing is, your head moves sometimes too, so you've got to have a line to your head. You
got to be coordinated.
That's right.
Well, the idea that your job is so complex, a robot could never do it, that is kind of true for most humans right now, but as you can see in the article, helping robots be less robotic, that reality is becoming less and less true as time passes. And you can kind of blame NIST for that in part. NIST and industry in general understand that in order for robots to be useful to small manufacturers and to allow larger manufacturers to offer more automated customization, and that's a key word there, customization, of high volume products, robots need to be more agile. I mean, and think about cars and cell phones where there's more and more of a push for mass customization. Robots would be ideal for that if they could change gears really quick, but currently robots are they're too cumbersome to retask, both physically and programmatically. So NIST is addressing this challenge head on with its Agility Performance of Robotic Systems project. The project's goal is to help manufacturing robot systems be more agile and to develop the measurement science that will allow manufacturers to assess and ensure the agility of their robotic system. Now, some of the key areas that NIST is looking at include, one, the ability of a robot to be rapidly retasked without the need to shut down. I mean, currently, that's usually not the case. You don't just have a robot doing a task and then just say, okay, well, go over there and do something different. It's got to be physically moved in many cases. It's got to be reprogrammed, retrained, and so forth. So it's not rapidly retasked. Number two, the ability of a robot to recover from errors. That's something that robots don't do very well. So for example, if a part is dropped, can the robot assess the situation and determine the best way to recover from that and to proceed? Which is really, if you think about it, a very human-like attribute. I mean, we recover very quickly. We understand what's happened and how to respond. And finally, thirdly, manufacturers also want the ability to quickly swap robots from different manufacturers, swap in and out, so that a company isn't tied to a single robot brand. Now, of course, nothing gets innovation going like good old-fashioned competition, so NIST is developing a set of performance metrics to measure robot agility, which they are going to validate at the upcoming Agile Robotics for Industrial Automation competition, ARIAC, in 2017. It's co-sponsored by ABB, Siemens, and Dassault Systèmes. ARIAC will let teams test their robot control systems on a simulated manufacturing factory floor where the sponsors are going to throw agility challenges at them to see how well they respond. So if you're interested in that competition, there is a link to NIST ARIAC webpage toward the end of the article that's listed down below, the player page down there. So basically, how can we make robots smarter so that they can do more jobs that humans do, so we can put more humans out of work?
Well, but here's the thing. This whole idea of robots becoming more and more humanistic as we move forward, I think we're going to find as we go forward that it's a lot more difficult. I mean, the human brain doesn't really work mechanistically.
Well,
think about it.
We've talked about this before.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think that there's something to that. There's a soul there. The idea that when something drops, you can figure out in real time what's going on, what happened, and what you have to do with it. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I'm not a scientist, but to me, that seems like there's a germ of something there that you just can't program.
Well, if we get to the point where you can't tell the difference between me sitting here and the robotic me sitting here, then we'll have passed the Turing test. And
I can't tell now.
What can I say?
Anyway, that stuff is always fascinating to me, though. I tell you, it's great stuff. Right. Well, we'll keep our eye on it going forward. All right. Well,
speaking of people.
That's right. Speaking of people, a recent study from the Georgia Institute of Technology indicates that contrary to earlier research, men and women don't communicate in significantly different ways. Or at least they don't if they're working on a very similar, highly prescriptive type of writing assignment. The study was authored by Brian Larson, and he's an assistant professor at Georgia Tech's School of Literature, Media, and Communications. Titled Gender Genre, the Lack of Gendered Register in Texts Requiring Genre Knowledge. That was a tough one to say. The research appeared in the October issue of Written Communications, which is a quarterly peer-reviewed journal. In the study, Professor Larson analyzed approximately 200 legal memos written by first-year law students at a pair of Midwestern law schools. These students, both male and female, were given an assignment to write memoranda of law either in support of or in opposition to the dismissal or summary judgment of a claim. That's typical legal stuff, right? Stuff. It doesn't really matter so much what exactly it was. The important takeaway here is that these are very standardized legal letters, legal notes to a court for demands, different types of things.
And it was written.
And it was written. Okay. And the idea was that these were very trained people, which we're going to get to here in a minute. Okay. The papers, when analyzed by a computer, showed...
See? Computers taking over the job.
Oh, well... Okay, you're right. You are a computer, aren't you? You can own up, Dirk. I know. You passed the Turing test already, so it's good. Well, the papers were analyzed by a computer, and they showed essentially no structural language differences between the papers written by the men and the ones written by the women. Now, as I mentioned, prior research had revealed that there are some general differences in the ways in which men and women use written communication. For example, women have been shown in the past to use more verbs describing states of mind, such as feel, or realize, or anticipate. Men tended to cram lots of informational language into their writings with a heavy focus on nouns, prepositions, and attributed adjectives like writing legislative intent as opposed to simply writing intent. That's interesting, and I found that to be true as well. I think in looking at writings from men and women, when I know which gender is writing to me. So the question is, why did the current research indicate little, if any, gender difference when the prior information showed that there was a significant difference? Well, Larson postulates that it has to do with the nature of this particular type of subjects and the particular type of writing that those subjects undertook in this case. These are people, again, who are very, very highly trained in very, very similar ways, and they have a strong sense of cultural norms and an even stronger desire to avoid the negative consequence of a poor grade. Remember, these were assignments for law students. They all wanted to get good grades. They were very motivated to write in that way. So thus there was some, I guess you could call it herding together in this very similar voice, use of style and voice. In less rigid scenarios, such as social media posts, which is the example everybody uses, gender differences in written communications remain, and they're very strong. And it's in those types of writings that they were probably picked up on in the earlier studies, less formal, more informal types of writing. So one takeaway from this study is that highly trained male and female professionals in similar settings will offer written communication with little, if any, difference based on gender. Bias based on gender, which of course still does exist, we have to admit, simply has no basis in fact as a consequence. As it applies to this particular study, a brief presented by a male lawyer, for instance, versus one from a female lawyer, will be, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from one another. That's the key takeaway here, is this idea of gender bias, that there's certain tasks that a woman lawyer will be better at than a male lawyer. Is not true. There is no thing as a gender bias if people have a very prescriptive and they're very highly trained. If the assignment is very ordered culturally, aligned in that way, there's no difference. But again, socially, when you look at things like social media posts, yeah, there is a difference. Women
Right.
and men do communicate differently. But in this case, they don't. And that's a really key takeaway, is that in these professional settings, bias should not exist. There really isn't such a thing as a gender difference in terms of how they communicate.
Right, and I think, just really quickly, I think something that this doesn't get into, because it's a very narrow study looking at one thing, but actually is the importance, and this has been talked about, the importance of the different style of communication between men and women. I mean, in this case, when you're submitting a legal brief, you have a specific task, but within, for instance, it's been talked about within management, there is a difference in the way men and women tend, and this has been studied, that tend to communicate, which may actually be a good thing.
A good thing, yes.
There's different forms of communication, each lend their own good and sometimes negative things to a situation, but that can be mined, right. and that's, I think, important within a management. So it's kind of a different thing, but that came to mind as you were talking.
Agreed. No
right.
doubt about it.
In his article, CPK, Indispensable Index or Misleading Measure, Steve Daum quotes Mark Twain as saying, "Facts are stubborn things, but statistics are pliable." Wasn't Twain also the one who said lies, damn lies, and statistics?
Yeah, he wasn't a big fan of stats. He wasn't a big fan of statistics.
Strangely, just an aside, Barb Cleary, also from PQ Systems, had a great article she wrote about the poor maligned statistician, about going to a party and you don't want to admit you're a statistician, but it's a whole other story. Yeah. As many statisticians have pointed out, including Don Wheeler, CPK, the process capability statistic, can be easily manipulated. It's often used incorrectly without enough knowledge of what is needed to use it correctly. And as Don points out in his article, whether you are the producer or the consumer, if you are using capability analysis for decision making in your organization, you must fully understand its use and how to use it. So with us today to shed some light on CPK is Steve Daum, Director of Development for PQ Systems. Hi, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, Mike. Hello, Dirk. Thanks for having me on today.
Sure. So for those who aren't already familiar with industrial statistic, what is CPK and how is it used in general?
Okay. Well, CPK is just a statistic, and it's one of several statistics that are used when you're doing a capability analysis. And one of the most important ways that it's used is for communications within the supply chain. You mentioned producers and consumers. If you're making a product for someone, supplying it to them, you'll want to communicate with them about quality levels in a sort of consistent, agreed upon way. And CPK is one statistic that's used in this way. We talk to a lot of people who get into discussions either with their customers or their suppliers up and down the supply chain. And the question is, what is CPK? What does it mean? And how do we interpret it? How do we interpret this? So the best way for me to describe what it does is it answers this question for you, and that is, how capable is my product or my process of meeting the customer needs? And the customer needs in this case are described or represented by specifications, which are also called tolerances. So, you're familiar with an example like brake pads. They may need to be 10 millimeters thick, and maybe the customer is willing to accept them up to 11. So in that case, the target is 10, and the upper spec or the upper specification is 11. So using those two numbers, and then using measurements taken from your brake pads, you can calculate CPK. And it's a very easy thing to calculate, but it's also a sophisticated representation of the answer to that question, which is, how capable is my process of meeting the customer needs? So typically you'll get an answer when you make this calculation, maybe between 0 and 3. Now the number can be negative, and that's a bad thing. It can be higher than 3. Many of your customers may have a requirement for what your CPK should be. Maybe they say it should be at least 1.33. The important thing to know about CPK is that the higher it is, the less likely you are to deliver into the supply chain product that doesn't meet the requirements. So that's basically what it is and what it's used for.
Good. All right. So now that we understand a little bit about what CPK is, so maybe you can help us understand what it isn't. I mean, how is it misused, or maybe how is it misunderstood and then misused?
That's a good question. If you think about going to your doctor, one of the first things they do is take your blood pressure, and that's an important, piece of data about your overall health. But when your doctor, probes further into why you're there to visit, there will be many other factors that come into play, and they won't focus solely on the blood pressure reading. Now, maybe if it's really out of whack, that'll be their main concern, but they'll have a lot of other questions. CPK is similar to this. It's important and it's useful, especially as a communication tool to communicate quality levels, but it's not the only thing people should be thinking about. It does tell you how well you're able to produce within the tolerances, but it also comes with some assumptions about how it's calculated, some assumptions about the data, and some things that need to be in place beyond just capability for it to be a valid representation of your process. One misuse of this is that people will focus solely on this one number, and they won't look at their system with an overall statistical mindset, an SPC way of thinking about how they manage, their product and their processes.
So I mean, in your article, and maybe you've kind of already touched on this, but you mentioned in the title, it's indispensable index or misleading measure. So what you just described, is that how people are misled? They see this, I've got a CPK of 1.3, therefore everything is fine. But isn't that the case? I mean, how is that misleading? I guess I just don't understand why, if they have that number, they might be misled. If you can maybe just describe that a little bit further.
Okay. First of all, a customer, someone buying your brake pads from you, for example, they'll want your CPK to be higher. Now, once you know how to calculate CPK, and it's not difficult, and once you look at the formulas, you'll understand that there's only a few things you can do to make your CPK higher. And some of them don't have anything to do with making your product better. One example is that if you sample more frequently, say every 1 minute rather than every 15 minutes, you may see your CPK value start to increase. Now, you haven't changed your process or your product at all, but you're reporting a slightly higher CPK because the variation from samples taken close together, will cause the CPK to grow a little bit. It can cause the CPK to grow. So that's one possibility. We talk to a lot of people, and they work hard to improve quality, but their customers, have a certain amount of pressure on them to produce analytical results, within their specifications. And so it's not always true that education about CPK, and more importantly, the broader statistical approach to improving quality, those aren't always the top priority in a manufacturing organization. And so, we talk to a lot of people. They're under pressure to have higher CPKs, and they often ask questions about, how do I make my CPK higher? So overall, people have good intent, they do good work, but there are ways to manipulate the statistic. And like I mentioned in the previous question, it can't be your only focus. You have to understand that if you do a capability analysis for some process that's wildly out of control, you'll get an answer back. And today it might be a good answer, but tomorrow, because your process is not predictable, it could be a bad answer. So you just have to be careful. You have to be more holistic in how you deal with CPK.
Well, that's a nice lead in, actually, in the couple of minutes we got left. It's a nice lead in to something that you mentioned in your article. You have something which you called the 6-way analysis, and I believe we have a slide of that here that we can put up. If you can just tell us a bit what the 6-way analysis is and how that maybe ties into the more holistic approach that you just mentioned.
Okay, great. Yeah, the 6-way analysis is a more overall view of things, and one of the things you'll see on this page is that it does have a CPK number on it. Now, because of the screen I'm looking at, I can't read it right now, but that's just one value in the lower right-hand corner of the chart. If you look in the upper left, you'll see an individual's chart. That's a control chart, And so it gives you some idea of how the process is behaving and where it is centered. And if you see the red squares on there, that's an indication that there's some variation there that maybe could be explained and possibly acted upon. So that's what's in the upper left is the individual's control chart. Below that is moving range, where you look at not just where the process is centered, but how much it varies over time. Because again, you want to be holistic. Where is it centered? What's the variation? That's the first two charts. Then in the bottom left is a run chart, and again, it's just a time series view of the data. It gives you some context about what has happened recently, rather than just looking at one point in time. On the right side of the chart at the top, you see the histogram, which gives you an idea of the shape of the distribution. Once you get into capability analysis, there are some assumptions made about that shape of that distribution, so it's good to be able to visualize that. In the middle, we have a normal probability plot, and that gives you an idea of how close to the normal distribution this set of data is falling. And then in the bottom right is a summary analysis that kind of gives you a visual of the allowable spread that the customer has defined. That's their upper and lower tolerance. What is your process producing most of the time? And so this is a good way to visualize that. And like I said earlier, CPK is just one value that's shown on this screen, but if you can learn to take in this six-way analysis and look at each piece, you'll get a lot more value and meaning about what's going on out of it.
So not just trusting in one number, but being familiar with all the various tools that are available to you, and to be looking at all of those to get like you said, a more holistic view of what's going on with your process. Well, if you're interested in more about CPK and so forth, be sure to join us for the live webinar that Steve is presenting next Thursday. CPK, Indispensable Index or Misleading Measure. That's going to be next Thursday, December 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Be sure to sign up for that. There's a link down underneath the player page down there. You can click, go out and sign up for it. Steve, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right, and we'll see you on Thursday.
Okay.
All right, terrific. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Steve. Bye. Yeah, everyone out there, if you're interested in this topic, a lot of you already are registered for it, but if you haven't yet, be sure you check that one out. Keep an eye on your inbox as well, because there'll be an email coming for you about that also. So
operators are standing by.
Standing by, that's right. Register for that webinar. It'll be a good one. All right, well, innovation, management versus enablement. It's the name of an article from Jeffrey Phillips, an innovation consultant working for a training company named OVO. This article, which first ran on OVO's Innovation on Purpose blog, also appeared in Wednesday's issue of Quality Digest Daily. You see it right there from Jeffrey Phillips. Well, the subhead on this one, as you saw right there, I think, subhead with those of us in the business called the kicker.
The kicker.
That's right, we call that the kicker. That's right, Dave, very, very professional outfit we have here, so we like to use the proper terminology. But yeah, the kicker on this one was, can you codify creativity? And that's really, I think, the issue at work here. Is the idea is can innovation be codified? Can innovation and creativity work together? Can management and innovation work together in a creative sense? And really, if you think about it, innovation and creativity demand freedom. That's probably the biggest thing that you need if you want to be innovative and creative. And because everyone really generates ideas in kind of their own individualistic way, trying to order and manage that output is really a losing game. All you're going to get if you do that is the same type of kind of cookie cutter idealization, and you're really not going to get a lot of fresh ideas from the outside coming in there. And the term you use here is enable, and enable is used so often in a bad way. We don't want to enable our people, but in this case, you want to enable your people to be creative. You don't want to overmanage them. So you're setting up an opposition here between enabling your people versus managing them. Enabling is letting them bubble up with their good ideas versus the top-down management. That's a key thing to keep in mind here. Well, the other extreme really doesn't work very well either. This idea that companies need structure, and without it, great ideas can't really be properly brought to market, and you can't get the benefit of that. So the idea is on both ends of this extreme, whether you just let creativity run amok or that you manage it to death, you're going to really suboptimize the whole innovation process. So the question, of course, is what to do. Well, Phillips suggests that you kind of loosen up the management bonds there. You loosen up the management mindset and you essentially rein in your managers, even if it's just a little bit, so that you let your people be a little more creative. Well, that's a great start, but if you think about that and you really do that, what's going to happen is you're going to handicap your managers. You're not really going to let them do what they do best. And managers manage. That's what they're there to do. And there's going to be a backlash from that. You're going to have unhappy and kind of ineffective people on your team because the managers are there, again, to manage, to make things work. And if you try to rein them in too much and say, well, you can't manage these innovative people, these innovative teams, we're going to prevent you from doing that, they're going to be frustrated. You're not going to get a lot of value out of them either. So my thought on this, I had my own thought on this. Jeffrey Phillips did not say this, but I will. I don't want to ascribe this to Mr. Phillips because he might be mad at me. But my idea was here, let the inmates run the asylum to a point. I think you want to pretty much let your innovative teams, when they're doing that function, because they won't be innovative all the time, they're going to be doing other things. But when you gather your creative people, your development people together to innovate and create and come up with new products and services, let them alone. I say don't manage them at all. Don't have any management on that process. Let them simply create, come up with ideas, bounce them off each other, get wild, get crazy, figure out whatever they can and can't do. And then at that point, after you've come up with some ideas that the team thinks are really interesting ideas, that are things that can be done and that should be done within the framework of the organization, then you bring in your managers. At that point, you bring in the managers and they begin to review those things and they say, well, what can we do? What would the market support? What would our stakeholders support? What can we afford to do? What should we do? What are our competitors doing? And then shepherd it through the process at that point to bring it to market. You need both ends of this machine. You need the people that are going to be creating ideas constantly and coming up with great things to do. And then you do need the people to shepherd that process along and make sure that it's practicable and can be brought to market. But I think purely for the innovative part of this, I don't think you need to manage it at all. I don't think that you should manage it. I don't think you can manage it. And if you try to manage it again, you're going to suboptimize what those managers are there to do. They're going to be frustrated, and the innovative people are probably going to be pretty frustrated too. So the takeaway for me is let creative people be creative, don't restrain them, come up with the ideas, and then worry about having to bring them to market.
Yep.
I think that's the best, to me that's the best approach.
Yeah.
And I think that too often people think they need to do both things at the same time, and you just can't.
Right.
You're just not going to be able to do it that way. And if you try to, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. You're not going to get great products, and even if you do somehow get good products, you're not going to be able to bring them to market at that stage. So that's my own thought on how you would.
Good stuff from Mr. Phillips as usual.
That's right. Good stuff there by Mr. Phillips. We've had a few things from Jeffrey Phillips in the newsletter in the past.
All right, well, now it is time for our Tweet of the Week. Mm-hmm. And this week's Tweet of the Week comes from, Albert Einstein? No, it comes from Bad Manager v. Great Leader. Oh, Bad Manager v. Great Leader. Okay, I get it. It's the first time we've seen this. There we go. Yeah. And that tweet is, I have no special talents. I am only passionately curious, attributed to Albert Einstein.
And he also says down there, if you look at it,
bring that back up there. I didn't see that.
There's a second part of that. Logic will get you from A to B. Imagination will take you everywhere. I like that.
Yeah,
I like that.
By the way, I think that actually that tweet ties in pretty good to yours as well as innovation too. I mean, you have to be willing to let your people go so that they can actually do the stuff he's talking, pursue their passion, and sometimes their passion may be slightly off track, but related to something that the company's trying to accomplish. And if you try to constrain them too much rather than let them experiment on the edges, you're probably going to quash innovation as well. So.
Yeah, and logic and imagination are good axes to think about in this way. Right. I mean, every company needs to have needs to kind of tread that line between being logical and being ordered and being imaginative and thinking up great things. And that's what we're all here to do, is to come up with great stuff to do. Who wants to do the same thing every day, like a robot, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want to be robotic. I mean, I know it works for you, but it's like
pretty much
not for the rest of us.
Sit at my desk and drink coffee.
Right. Okay, well, that's our show for today. Thanks again to Steve Dahm of PQ Systems for joining us on the show. And speaking of Steve, as we mentioned, he's going to be joining us. Dirk's going to be hosting, and Steve will be presenting a live webinar next week called CPK, Indispensable Index or Misleading Measure. Again, that's this coming Thursday, December 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. Again, there'll be an email in your inbox that you can register for that next week.
Yep.
There's also a link in the story, and there's a link I think you put on the player
There's a
page
link
as
on the
well.
player page as well. Yep.
So check that out and register for that. A lot of you registered for it already, but if you haven't yet, jump in there. You're going to get a good deep dive on what CPK and capability is all about.
That's it. Well, thanks for joining us this week, and we will see you next Friday.
That's right. Next Friday for another great QDL. So have a great weekend, and we'll see you then.
So long.
Bye.